Okay, so it is 12:01. I'm sure we're going to be having some other folks log in. So as they're doing that, I would just like to welcome everyone to our last webinar in our webinar series for Professional Development Week. This is our annual series we do every December to kind of wind up the semester, give people the ability to kind of focus on their own professional development, hopefully as things are kind of wrapping up on campus. So we'll offer this every December. For everyone who is registered, you'll get a survey, an evaluation, and we ask that you give us some feedback about the topics that we offered this week. And then also we'll ask for your input for what you'd like to see in the next professional development week. So again, thank you for participating. I'm happy to close the week with one of our own at the CPD. I'd like to introduce to you Megan Martin. She is a program coordinator on the delivery and services team working for the Center for Professional Development. And as we chatted about this morning, Megan, you've been on our team for 3 years. So you got your anniversary and you're presenting today. So
yeah, that was exciting to see. Like I didn't even know, and it just popped up on my LinkedIn. It was like 3 years today.
very good. So Megan, I have to look at this acronym. Megan is CPACC certified. And the way that we talk about it at the CPD is we say CPAC certified. CPAC stands for Certified Professional in Accessibility Core Competencies. So she was able to achieve that this year. She is also pursuing her master's degree in instructional design from Syracuse University. She is also a alumnus of SUNY Brockport. And I've got to look here at your degrees. She has a BA in political science, international relations, a BS in women and gender studies with 2 minors, Spanish and communications. So I'd like to introduce Megan. Do you have your sidekick with you, Megan? Is Mia there?
Mia got put away for the professional
Oftentimes
presentation.
We see her, our kind of honorary additional staff person, in Mia, Megan's dog. So anyways, Megan, thank you so much. And we'll turn things over to you.
No problem. Thanks so much, Lisa, for the intro. I'm excited to get started. Thanks everyone for joining me on the lunch hour. We're going to be discussing today some really important best practices for integrating accessibility into your everyday workflow. And I'm sorry if I am looking like I'm looking between 2 screens here. I have folks on one screen and my slides on another. So if I'm looking back and forth, that's why. But let's go ahead and get started. So Lisa did go over a little bit about me. I'm program coordinator with the CPD, getting my master's degree. The one that didn't get mentioned, that is my favorite fun fact, is I am a twin. I know there's another twin in the crowd here, so go twins if you have a twin. But that is my favorite fun fact. I always share it at the beginning of every presentation. Okay, so important things to cover. I always like to start a presentation with what this presentation is, so what folks can expect. And also what this presentation is not. So for what this presentation is, we're going to have an opportunity to understand the importance of accessibility to ensure all learners, including those with disabilities, can fully access resources, learn practical strategies for integrating accessibility best practices into everyday tasks, gaining insight to POUR principles, which also are referred to as POUR principles, and how those apply to digital content. We'll go over what each of those mean in greater detail in just a few moments. And then leaving here with some actionable steps. What can we do to improve the accessibility of our online resources and meet the needs of our diverse learners? What this presentation is not, it is not a technical deep dive. It is not a legal or compliance training. We do go over some adjustments that have been made to the ADA, specifically in relation to Title II law, that will be going into effect in April of 2026 for large higher education institutions. But this is not designed to be any legal or compliance training. If there's any questions regarding legality, I always encourage folks to go to their campus council. And this is also not a one-size-fits-all approach. There is a multitude of different ways that we can approach accessibility, that we can approach accessible design. These are just intended to be some best practices, things that we can do every day to ensure that our content is accessible. And also, I like to start with this quote. I've done a lot of research personally on accessibility. I do a lot at work at the CPD. I work with the Universal Design for Learning Initiative with Dr. Chris Romlick and Dr. Lauren Rodriguez. I know, Lauren, you're here. So I professionally do a lot of work with accessibility, but also in my master's degree, I do tend to focus my assignments on accessibility. So through my research, I really like to point this specific point out, this quote, and specifically the aspect where it says, the concept of accessibility seems inaccessible to many because at face value, the barrier to entry is high. Checklists in themselves can be intimidating, and a checklist that is upwards of 80 plus items may feel like a setup for failure. So there are a lot of different ways that we can make content accessible, as I just kind of mentioned, but this quote really kind of hits home because I feel like it's what many of us feel when we first start to kind of dig into accessibility. There is a lot of things that we can do, but the more that we practice and the more that we take steps, like even attending today's webinar, we're taking those actionable steps to improve our designs to make them more accessible for everyone. So let's attempt to unravel this ball of yarn. First, I've already done a little bit of talking. I just like to see what are some words that come to your mind if I ask you to define what accessibility means. You can go ahead and put those in the chat. If you want to come off of mute, it could just be like one word, two words, just things that come to your mind when you think of accessibility as a term. And I have the chat, so I'll be able to pull it up too. Leveling the playing field, that's a great one. Color blindness, okay. Ease, removing hurdles, available and open, fair, universal, equity, perfect. I love these. These are some great examples. Equitable, inclusion, access for all, great, perfect. All right, so that brings us to the point of what is accessibility and why is it important? Accessibility refers to designs of products, devices, services or environments for people with disabilities. And accessible design improves access for all. Let's think about, for example, curb cuts and sidewalks. When you're bringing a suitcase or pushing a cart up to a store, you use the curb cuts so that you don't have to lift something up. That's an accessible design for wheelchair users. That is something that's applicable and usable by everyone. Elevators, so that not everybody has to go upstairs. Auto opening doors, so that there's no twisting or turning of doorknobs. This is another great example, something that benefits all. In a group of 10 worldwide, 1 to 2 people are likely to have a disability. I like to point out with this statistic that even though it's saying 1 to 2 people worldwide, the worldwide definition of disability is drastically different from country to country. So it's quite possible that here in the US, we define disability differently than somewhere like Russia or somewhere like China, somewhere overseas that they might, number one, define disability differently, and number two, might have different reporting mechanisms for that. So this statistic is just something that I've gathered over time, but is something that needs to be taken into consideration that disability might be defined differently globally. And as of 2022, the behavioral risk factor surveillance system, there are 70 million adults in the US, and that's about every 1 in 4 that have a disability. And another important point is an able-bodied person can develop or acquire a disability at any time in their life. These things can be temporary from surgery. You could develop something like arthritis over time with age. So disability can impact all of us at any given point in our life, even if we are able-bodied. All right, and accessibility in higher education. I really like this slide because I think it really highlights and hits home the importance of accessible design, specifically within our context of higher education. So this is just a survey result that I got from EDUCAUSE, and it's just the different reports of things such as lawsuits related to technology accessibility, threat of legal action, investigation about technology accessibility. So things that are steps that are being taken, actions that are taken against institutions that are not being up to compliance with accessibility. 68% of respondents reported that their institution has faced at least one of these challenges. And then I have here the total enrollment for SUNY. So this is an overall. I know that we are a multitude of different campuses, 64. So many of us have different enrollment rates, but as an institution of SUNY as a whole, from last fall 2023, we have about 367,542 students in our throughout our campuses. And it's important to point out that larger institutions, which is defined as 15,000 plus, are more likely than other respondents to report facing these challenges. So that's really important to consider when we're talking about accessibility in higher education. We as a SUNY institution service a lot of students. We have a large student body, and it's important for us to keep in mind that we need to keep things accessible so that our students can access it, and also so that we don't face any legal issues. All right, and here's where we talk a little bit about some updates that have been made to ADA accessibility. So again, in higher education, the update. So on April 24th of this year, the Federal Register published the Department of Justice final ruling on an update to ADA, which, if you're not familiar with that acronym, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title II is going to provide specific requirements for how web content in mobile apps should be accessible to people with disabilities. So sorry, I always mess this up. I say triple, but I mean double. Level AA is the technical standard that will come into place with Title II. And when I say AA, within web compliance, there are 3 levels. So there's A, AA, and AAA. And AA encompasses level A and then some. And then AAA is something that encompasses even more. It's even more standards of accessibility. So for us, for Title II specifically, it will be that level AA. And later on in the presentation, I have an example of what that kind of means. So we'll go a little bit further into that later. But that will be the technical standard for state and local governments' web content and mobile apps. And this includes things like our learning management systems, our college portals, anything like that. So as I just kind of mentioned, public schools, community colleges, and public universities are included. And I do have here, once the slides get shared with folks, I have some links here for fact sheets and things like that, if you're interested in diving a little bit deeper into Title II and some of the implications that it will come with. All right, so first we're going to talk about categories of disabilities. So these are just overarching categories, and I'll give some examples of assistive technologies that are used with each of these disabilities. So motor disabilities, this affects a person's ability to move independently and purposefully. 3.5% of adults in the US have a mobility-related disability, and these can occur from birth, occur due to aging, or as a result of a disease or incident. They can be temporary, so something I kind of touched on earlier, where you might have surgery, or you might break a bone in your body where you can't walk. So things might come up as a temporary disability. They could be permanent or periodically recur or relapse, which is something like arthritis, where if you have arthritis, you might go through bouts where you become really unable to perform certain tasks like twisting or doing something with your hands, and it can continue to come back and kind of ebb and flow. Examples of assistive technologies for digital accessibility for this category of disability would be things like alternative keyboards. So those may be keyboards that I actually found this out recently, which is interesting and not something that I knew, but there exists keyboards that will refresh Braille. So when a screen reader or person with a disability is reading or having content read to them, it will refresh, and so they can read that. I didn't really know that existed until recently. So alternative keyboards also can be more ergonomic in this specific category for motor. So something that's a little bit easier to use. Speech recognition software and eye tracking technology, which if you have an iPhone, eye tracking technology just recently came out with a new iOS 18 update. I personally haven't tried it, but I'm curious to see if anybody here has tried it and if it works really well or not. But that's something cool that recently came out with Apple too. Auditory disabilities. So this involves hearing impairment, can involve hearing loss and deafness. Central auditory processing disorder, also known as ADP, is another disability in this category, which that refers to someone who is still able to hear, but they have an issue with organizing or keeping those sounds organized and those thoughts in their head. They have an issue kind of interpreting what's being said to them. So issues with processing verbal language. Most of the web is accessible for folks in this category because most of the web is in visual or text format, but that's not to say that there aren't assistive technologies for digital accessibility in this category. Things such as text transcripts for audio-only files, synchronized captions with video content. This one's pretty important because I don't know about anybody here, but I personally love captions when I'm watching TV. And when the captions don't line up, it can be hard to follow and it can be hard to know exactly what's going on at a given moment. So having captions that are synchronized with the speaking and with the content is important. Providing sign language interpretation if necessary. And then just a fast fact that I have on the slide, transcripts are the only way a person who is both deaf and blind can access video or audio content. Video nor audio directly are accessible to someone who is both deaf and blind. And then we move into cognitive disabilities. So there's no one way to describe these. It can be considered a spectrum of various ability / disability. Examples are things like limited comprehension, low tolerance for cognitive overload, which means that somebody has not a great ability to be able to process a lot of information or complex information at once, short-term memory loss, and attention deficit. So examples of assistive technologies here are easy to understand language on text-based information. And I know all of us working at SUNY and at campuses, we're very familiar with acronyms, but it's always important to spell out acronyms if you're going to use them so that folks are able to follow along and know exactly what you're talking about. It's not very jargony. Enable errors and clear solutions to fix those errors and create simple and organized designs that are user-friendly. Okay. Moving on to POUR, POUR principles. This area is one that I'm very comfortable with and I enjoy speaking about a lot. I've actually made a micro e-learning course in my studies. So I actually share that as a resource in these slides. So I've done a lot of work with the POUR principles. So I'm excited to share this piece. So what is POUR? POUR is a set of principles that are used to inform and lay foundation of success criteria and guidelines that build web content accessibility guidelines, which also are known as WCAG if you're familiar with that acronym. So if any of these principles are untrue, when designing content, users with disabilities will be unable to access the web. And so first we have perceivability. So this is information and user interface are presented in ways that can be easily perceived, so it can't be invisible to all senses. Operable, which is navigation and user interface must be operable by the user, and it must not require an interaction a user cannot perform. Understandable, content or navigation cannot be beyond a user's understanding. And robust. So this one is users must be able to access content across a variety of devices and must be able to do so as technologies advance. So as we get, the latest iOS updates, as we move towards AI is a great example. We're rapidly seeing the technology landscape evolve. So our content needs to be able to be accessible throughout those kinds of evolutions of technology. We need to ensure that the content and what we're putting out there for our users will remain accessible. And then just to go a little bit deeper into each one, so I have examples in everyday workflow for each of the POUR principles. For perceivable, examples of this include alt text for images, which I do go over in a little bit greater detail later on. Closed captions and transcripts to provide alternate format. Color contrast, so this is the example that you can see here on the screen. So I just use a free Chrome extension. There are certainly, I've seen many other tools that exist out there to check color contrast, but I link the one that I personally use in my slides here. So you can see that when we have a foreground and a background color that will pass a certain ratio of color contrast, we can see it'll say pass for AA large, AAA large, AA normal, and AAA normal. And here's where, as I was mentioning earlier, the technical standards. So for Title II, we'll be in AA compliance. So you can see here that the black and white color contrast example does pass double age large, which means large text, AAA large, which would be the higher level of compliance, AA normal text, which is size 12. It will pass that, and then AAA normal will pass. And then you can see an example below. I can't even look at it. It hurts my eyes to see the yellow and the white, but you can see there across all of those technical standards, it does fail. Operable, so examples of this in everyday workflow are time limits. So I personally love time limits. I'm always in another browser. I'm always, doing something else. And then when I return, I'm like, ooh, I gotta click continue, and it will allow me the chance to continue where I left off. But this is actually an example of the principle operable, because they should be given the opportunity to adjust the time or continue time if needed. If they need extra time to get through a form, or even in the example of someone like me who easily can get distracted and goes to another browser. So this is an example of operable. Avoiding flashing or flickering information or graphics that could cause seizures for folks with epilepsy. Navigation options, so users should be able to navigate and orient themselves easily. So this is having multiple navigation mechanisms, breadcrumb trails, and site searches. So I have an example here on the side of where you can see a breadcrumb. So I'd be able to go backwards from my folder that says CPAC back to my documents and then back to my files. So just having different navigation pinpoints where a user can easily navigate the site. Understandable. So this is things like error messages. I think a best example, and I'm sure everyone here can relate to this, when you're typing in an email or a username and a password, and you get an error message that says, oops, wrong password, that counts as something as understandable. You're performing an action and you're clearly told what is wrong. Your password is incorrect, your password expired, anything like that. So a clear error message to indicate to the user what it is exactly that's occurring. Avoiding jargon or complex wording. We kind of went over this a little bit earlier when I mentioned that we all work at institutions that like to use a lot of acronyms. So avoiding that jargon or complex wording that might not make sense to everyone, being sure that we're clear and understanding in our delivery of that content. Confirmation screens. This is very similar to error messages, but just this is alerts a user that they have either successfully or not reached the end of an input process, and or they've reached the point of decision. So the example here is, are you sure you want to permanently delete 2 items? This is an example of a confirmation screen, or that point of decision, making sure that it's clear to the user that this action will end in this result. Robust. So this is video should work regardless of device or browser being used to watch them. And I have an image here of just somebody sitting on an iPad with the YouTube screen. This is, I prefer YouTube as just a personal preference for ensuring that video content is accessible. I find I have the most luck with sharing, uploading, making sure my captions can be uploaded correctly with YouTube. Versus something like Microsoft, where I'm sure we all experience the you don't have permissions to view error. So I find that YouTube can be the most universal, so that's why I have a picture there. But that's an example of robust, that the video should work regardless of the device or browser being used. Accessible fields. Can users access a field without relying solely on using a mouse? So tabbing. I don't know about anybody here, but clicking on everything can get very time consuming, whereas if I'm just typing something, I can hit tab and move across a form. That's actually an example of being robust. The fields are accessible and can be accessed with not just a mouse. Differentiating controls. The controls are clearly laid out and functional, and it's clear what each control does. So differentiating something like the submit button from something like a drop down arrow or a text input or multiple choice, just making sure that submit or things that are going to do different actions are clearly laid out and easy to know which is which. All right, now we're moving into best practices. I do see the chat. I know it's going over some questions. I will get to that at the end. I'm the type of person that I need to wait to the end. So I will get to that in a minute, but I appreciate everyone putting their thoughts into the chat. Best practices in everyday workflow. All right, well, I know Lisa mentioned Mia earlier, and I knew that Mia would make a guest appearance here. But this is an example of alternate text. So what is that? Alternate text, if you haven't heard, is used to provide a brief description of an image to a user who may be using assistive technology. In this case, this is an example from Word. So if I right click on an image, I can view the alt text and hear the pop-up. Word does a pretty good job of explaining what alt text is, and does have some good accessibility tools as well. But how would you describe this object or image to someone who is blind or low vision? So you can see here too, a dog lying on a couch. This description was automatically generated by Word, which is a nice new feature, and I'm seeing that a lot with a lot of tools. I know Canva has something similar where if you go to your alt text in an image and hit generate for me, it will generate an alternate text format for you for that image. The one thing I will caution with that though is even if Word or even some kind of other AI tool embedded in the software is giving you alternative text, it's always a good idea to give it that human eye. Make sure that you review it and make sure that that is what is the image, because sometimes you might get things like, instead of a dog lying on the couch, it might say, I don't know, a gray blanket on the couch. And that's not exactly what this image is depicting. So always good to give it a human eye overlook before confirming that that alt text is correct. And you can see here as well, the mark as decorative. So that's not to say that you have to go through every image on your PowerPoint and give it a name like star or some decorative framing that you've put around an image icon. You could mark that image as decorative if it doesn't have any value or meaning to the content. So you can go ahead and do that as well to any images that might just be decorative or there to not really serve any purpose to the content being delivered. And then to continue on to alt text, I know this often is a question that comes up, what to do if it's a table or a complex image. And this is an example of something that it was an image in a slide, in a PowerPoint slide. So for this, an example of providing alt text would be just a basic description of what the image is depicting. In this case, it was a UBD lesson template. And then in the notes or in a separate link within the content, I linked to the UBD lesson template that was in a more accessible format. So in a Word document, in a PDF, in something that could be opened up on the side of this image, but just giving a brief description of what an overview of this content is, and then providing the option to click to view that content in an alternate format. All right, links. This is another one of my favorite ones because I know that a lot of people don't know this, but when you are dealing with links, anything that is considered bare, which is just that basic format of www dot and then the rest of your link, that actually would read to a screen reader like www.suny, and that hearing that over and over it's just not great for accessibility when somebody is trying to go through your content and is trying to understand what this link is, but they're just hearing the letters that spell out the link. Instead, what you can do is embed links. So that is taking, for example, this our UDL website and turning it into Universal Design for Learning at SUNY website and hyperlinking that entire either word or short phrase so that it's clear where exactly the user will end up when they click this link. And another cool thing that I found out about screen readers is that if somebody opts to do so, they can have all of the links listed for them and hear all of the links first. So having embedded links will be clearer to somebody, okay, here are the links, here's what they do, instead of having to hear the www dot over and over again. It just makes it a lot more clear and a lot more, honestly, in my opinion too, a lot more cleaner in a design to see this embedded link versus that bare link. And also to ensure that only links are underlined. So only underlining things in your content that actually are links and not underlining words as a way to convey meaning. So making sure that only links are underlined in your content. And I like to also mention that a good RGB, which stands for red, green, blue, the color of a link is 00255, which is that bright blue color, because it really makes it stand out to what is a link versus what's not. But also that's not to say if you're using, this wouldn't necessarily look good on a black background or a dark background. So you could certainly not make it that bright blue. But when I'm working on a Word document or when I'm working on something that is a white background, I do prefer to differentiate links with that bright blue so it's clear and we all recognize this as a link. Color. So we did touch on this a little bit earlier with the color contrast checker, but just ensuring that color contrast does not make it difficult to read. And then also not relying on color to convey meaning, very similar to what we just talked about with the making sure that only links are underlined. So in my example, I'm using this sentence as an important example. If I were to make content and I put every important object as red, color is not conveyed to a screen reader. So if you were trying to convey meaning through color, that's not an accessible design because not everyone would be able to know that the red is pointing out that this is an important item. So if you are going to use color, I do recommend having some kind of like legend or something aside that will just let users know items in red. If we're just talking about like fruit, for example, apples, oranges, bananas are all in red. And then that way it's easier for folks who are using a screen reader or who can't differentiate color. In the example of color blindness, you're providing an alternate format for them to know that, okay, these were the important concepts that were in that color. And apparently I'm on a fruit kick because I use fruit in the example here. But heading structures are another great example of best practices and something that's really easy to do. So in this example, heading 1 is something like your title or an overarching concept. So in my example here, I like to use fruit. And then heading 2 would be examples of that heading 1. So it's things like cherries, blueberries, strawberries, apples. Heading 3, you're going to get into the more specific examples of heading 2. So it's a nested concept kind of, and I like to just have this as an example for the visual, but heading structures aid in organization and navigation, and they're arranged by that rank or level, so that nested structure. So it's helpful to folks who are using a screen reader to have these heading structures because then the content is read to them in an organized manner and not in a manner that's, out of order in reading that Empire apples come before fruit or vice versa, all of those out of order themes. So I like this. I like the heading structures because it also makes things clean and it makes navigation a lot easier. So just making sure that they follow a certain order and that you're not mixing the headings so that it can remain organized and structured. All right, here we get into tools. I know I talked a little bit earlier about Microsoft's alt text feature, but Microsoft, as well as Adobe, as well as Google, do have embedded accessibility checkers. So I know in Word, it's on the review tab. You hit review and then check accessibility, and it will actually list where you could be making some accessibility updates, whether that's providing alt text to an image you might have missed. The structure of the headings will be there as well. So that's just a great way to make sure that any work you're doing in Word is going to be accessible to somebody with a disability. Adobe PDF is definitely one of the harder ones to make accessible, the tags and things like that. But what I do recommend is that if you are going to make a PDF, that you first make it in Word, check it for accessibility, and then convert it to a PDF. That tends to be the more accessible option, but PDF does have an accessibility checker as well, which is really helpful. I think it's in one thing I did notice about Adobe is that when I went to add the accessibility tool, it's not natively on my toolbar. I actually had to go to add more tools and add the accessibility feature to Adobe. And then Google also has one. I don't love the Google one. It's not as clean to me as Word. I've used it a couple of times, and to me, it just kind of is like, okay, we're going to turn accessibility on, and then it doesn't really provide that kind of, okay, here's where you could be improving. But it does exist and it is there and it is getting better, but I prefer personally Word to make sure that my content is accessible. All right. So here, I know if you were here earlier with us, Lisa and I were talking about making sure we talked about Deque, but these are just some additional resources. So we did go over some best practices that you can do every day, but certainly that is not an exhaustive list. And certainly there are other things that can be added to the concepts that we talked about. So I include here some resources for you if you want to do some more investigating. They're for heading structures, tables, tips for designing, Adobe PDF, which like I said, can be pretty challenging. I have a link there to a resource. And Deque University, which is free for SUNY. So through SUNY, we have a partnership with Deque, and you can request an account. This link will actually take you to the site where you can request to have a Deque account made for you. And Deque offers a wide range of different courses. So things like, I think I've taken Fast Track for accessibility for designers, document creators. There are specific ones for Word, Adobe, Excel. So all of those trainings are right there housed in Deque. That's actually where I took my CPAC prep. So Deque offers a free CPAC prep course so that I could then go to take the CPAC exam. So that also lives in Deque. So again, this link, when you click it, it will take you to the SUNY at Deque site where you can then request an account be created for you. And then, as I mentioned earlier, my micro e-learning course on POUR principles, my shameless plug, if anybody wants to take it, I did make it in Articulate Rise, which is a great platform. But if anybody wants to kind of dive a little deeper into POUR principles, I do have that e-learning course available. So paving the way, getting others on board. So these are steps to implement web accessibility as recommended by W3C, which I should have mentioned earlier, and I apologize, I forgot that. But W3C actually stands for World Wide Web Consortium. So it is the Web Accessibility Initiative from the group that enacts WCAG, so the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and POUR principles. So these are recommendations by that working group. So they recommend initiate, plan, implement, and sustain. And each one has different steps that you can take. So initiate, I think a lot of us are kind of at this point. I know personally, I started here developing that understanding of accessibility and building the organizational enthusiasm. So this is learning the basics, which you just kind of did with some examples. So learning the basics of accessibility, setting your objectives. Where do we want to go with this? What is our goal? What is our hoped for outcome? Raising awareness of the importance of accessibility. Plan, developing clear goals in an environment that supports accessibility. So that's creating an accessibility policy, reviewing your environment and your websites. I know at the CPD, one thing that we've done personally is we put a report an accessibility issue on the bottom of a lot of our web pages so that if there is an accessibility issue that we don't catch, it can be filled out by somebody and they can let us know and then we can remediate that issue. So that is kind of an example of that accessibility policy. What are some things that you can do where users can let you know that there's an issue and so that you can have it remediated? Implementing, so ensuring that folks are trained on your staff, the tools are available. and accessibility is included throughout. Integrating your goals into your policies, prioritizing issues. This is a big one because like I kind of mentioned earlier in that quote, the checklist of 80 plus items can be really daunting, but what are the things that are the most important? What are the things that are really sticking out as needing to be remediated? Is it going through and making sure all of your images have alt text? Is it making sure that your heading structure or that the color contrast makes sense on your sites and on your content? So making sure that you're prioritizing the issues will also help you to kind of chip away to ensure that you're in full compliance with accessibility standards. Tracking and communicating progress, another big one, making sure that everybody on your team is aware of what's going on, what policies are going to be put into place, and able to communicate your progress with one another. Sustaining, so monitoring websites, engaging with your stakeholders, which we kind of do with that report and accessibility link, making sure that users are able to give you feedback. Is there something that maybe you weren't aware of that can be remediated and adjusted? And incorporating that user feedback. So making sure that you're taking that into consideration of what users have reported to you as an accessibility issue. And I do include here a WebAIM checklist. So this is just a PDF from WebAIM that it's related more to the core principles than anything. So just little things that can be remediated in everyday tasks to ensure content is accessible. But that, I think, leads us to reflections and Q&A. So I know we're at about a little over 15 minutes from end, and we can either have a discussion with these questions. If folks have questions, we can certainly have questions now. I'm going to be opening the chat, so I'll take a look. But let me see. All right. So I'm seeing one more than physical disabilities, correct, invisible ones. Yep. So anything, again, the categories that we discussed are just overarching, but it can include a wide array of disabilities. And I apologize if I missed any, but yes, not just physical, but it can be invisible as well. Would you share the URL for the Chrome extension? Yeah. So let me see if I can get that out of here if I go back. You know what, I'll come back to that one. I know the slides are going to be shared, so that link will be included in the slides that get sent out. So you will be able to grab that there. But if at the end I have time, I'll just go back and grab that and put it in the chat.
Yeah, I just want to remind people I will be sending out, like Meg said, I will be sending out a follow-up email with her slides. So I'll send it right after this session.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Allie. And then I'm seeing it is hard to explain this one to faculty for understanding. Yes, as with any, innovation, not necessarily even innovation, just new idea, we're going to be changing. This is, I think the other day in a webinar, I heard about Title II. It's going to be a paradigm shift. We're going to see, we're all going to have to take part in this, making sure our content is accessible. So that includes faculty. We're going to all need to be aware of things that we can do to make our content accessible for users. But just even having these conversations about, Title II compliance, the legality of this, what this means for our institutions, even bringing the points of, what I showed earlier with the EDUCAUSE survey, there's legal repercussions to be had if compliance is not met. So, but I do understand it is hard to communicate to faculty for understanding, as we all have content that's been created and that it's been out there for many years, and it's hard to go back and to remediate.
I have a question.
Sure.
Usually when, by the way, in our college, SUNY Poly, we use, in particular in College of Business, we have a synchronous online MBA program and also the online program. And I think these ideas that you bring, even though they are not new, when you put them together the way you did, is very beneficial, at least to me.
Yeah.
I see them. But one question I have is that there is Pearson, Cengage, Brightspace, which is the platform that we use. And then there is the instructor who has to implement some of these different approaches to ensure accessibility. And also there is the Office of Accessibility, which also has another responsibility. So my point is the emphasis should be where? The instructor, which is responsible for the course and the content and making it accessible, or the technology or other aspects that we use in the course, like as I say, Pearson, Cengage, and even Brightspace, that provide the elements to make sure that this happens.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll go back to that webinar that I attended the other day, where we had a national disability expert from the Department of Ed come and talk a little bit more specifically about Title II and what that means. But I think the most important takeaway with all of this change in Title II to ADA, and to your point about how there's so many touch points, right? We have folks in the disability offices, we have the instructors, we have instructional designers, but at the end of the day, everyone's going to have some piece in this game of making sure that our content is accessible. So that is instructors in the sense of their slides, their documents, their handouts. They're not going to be copying in those readings as easily anymore. You know, you're going to have to go through and make sure that the documents that they're uploading for students are accessible. That's also instructional designers, though, when we're talking about using those materials to create a course that is accessible. So things like, is the navigation clear? Is, is this linked correctly? Going to even disability offices. I know that a lot of folks are if there's anybody here that's in a disability office that wants to speak about what you're doing in your role on your campus, you're already using and accommodating, making those accommodations for students with disabilities. So we're all going to have to know the basics, because what about if I send you an email that isn't accessible? There's going to be it's all digital. So I think the important thing to take away is that we're all going to have some kind of responsibility, because it's going to be a much larger paradigm shift into this digital accessibility. So, but that's a great point, to ask, like, who is responsible? I think the best answer that I can give is that everyone should feel a sense of responsibility to ensure that content is accessible. Let's see. And I didn't know, so I'm just reading this. Thanks for reviewing this. I've been seeing this on learning management system. I wasn't sure. Oh, the decorative, yeah. So decorative versus the writing out a description. Yeah, I'm glad that was helpful to you. Descriptive text with the link to the URL. Yep, that too can be included in there. I think that's called title in the alt text area, or in the link URL area. Emailing the slides. Do you have a recommended priority checklist to get started on the 80 items, like the first 10? Good question. I personally don't have a recommended priority, because, like I said, it really depends on the state of your environment, on where you are at. Are you already kind of incorporating some of these best practices? Have you not even known what alt text was until today when you came to this webinar? So I think a lot of us are at different starting places when it comes to accessibility. So it would be hard to say here's priorities, but I think what is the most important, or perhaps the first step that we could take, is to use those accessibility checker tools like that are built into Word, Adobe, even I've seen a couple, maybe I'll include that one too, I'll add it to the slides, but there is DeCue University has a plugin that's called AxeDev Developer, and it's a bit more advanced, but it will run a website scan and tell you where the critical issues and serious issues are in accessibility compliance, and it will guide you through. But again, that is a little bit more advanced. I didn't touch on that in this presentation, but I can include it as a resource if folks are interested. But there's just different things that we can do to review so that we know what we have to remediate. So that's maybe where I would start, is figuring out where we're at. Where am I? Do I need to start here? Do I need to start going through images? But not necessarily a recommended priority, because I think that's really different depending on the status of your sites and content. Does anyone know if Canva also has an accessibility checker? So I'm in Canva a lot. I actually made this PowerPoint in Canva, and Canva is not the best in terms of accessibility. So like even this slide, for example, there are 4 different areas where I had to go and click to make sure that I had alt text marked as decorative, even on this slide where the purple is. So I don't think they have an accessibility checker. I know also that they don't have heading structure. So you can't assign things like heading 1, heading 2, heading 3 to various texts. That's why I actually had to bring in my screenshot of an image from Word. So Canva is not the best in terms of accessibility. So I don't think they have an accessibility checker, but I do know that they have the alt text feature. I'm sure things will be coming out with them that might be updated, but I just haven't seen that yet. Let's see. Could you recommend any organizations aside from the ADA that I can follow to stay updated on tools and regulations? Also, does SUNY have an accessibility committee to share ideas? Besides ADA, say update on tools and regulations. This is a great question. And I'm not off the top of my head. I personally just think of ADA and that group that I mentioned, the W3C consortium. They're the World Wide Web Consortium. They make the WCAG guidelines. They're a great resource, and a lot of the links that I include in the slide for that Adobe PDF, tables, headings, links you right to that group because they provide a lot of great resources. So I would definitely recommend staying up to date with the government sites and also that W3C group, because they have a lot of really great trainings and also resources. And SUNY having an accessibility committee to share ideas, I'm not too sure about this one. I know that we have EIT officers on every campus. I don't know if Lauren is here, and I don't want to call her out, but we do have the EIT officers on every campus. I'm not sure exactly who that list is, but there might exist those folks on your campus to discuss as well. Will there be required additional training offered? Again, I'm not sure. I just know, the basics here of the best practices, what's going to be coming, but in terms of the what are we going to do, I'm personally not too sure about that. I don't know what each campus will decide to be as required or additional training. I know I link here the UDL site. So UDL initiative at SUNY, we offer some free courses and trainings as well alongside what I mentioned with DeQ. So we have a couple of our spring offerings that will be announced soon on that website. So if you click that website, there are some courses there that the UDL initiative offers. So you can check those out. Third-party products being used by instructors in their Brightspace course. Is this question asking more about like what with the integrations, like who is responsible, or is it just like a question? I guess, does the person that put this question about what about third-party products being used by their instructors, MindTap, if you want to clarify?
Who's going to be responsible for the accessibility when the instructors use those products in the course? How do we make sure that they meet the standards?
Another good question. Another kind of legal implication that I'm not sure about. And that's why I kind of wanted to warn folks. I knew the mention of Title II would generate a lot of questions, and these are great questions. I'm not diminishing that by any regard, but it is going to be important that as we kind of move towards this Title II, as we learn more, to be looking towards your campus for guidance on that, because there are going to be a lot of legal things and implications with this that I'm just personally not sure about. So that's a great question. I just don't know the answer to that. Different approaches according to the field of study, math. This is a good question and an interesting question. So there are certainly different approaches in terms of making something like a math equation accessible, making sure that you're putting some kind of, and it's not even alt text, but it's I've seen how this is done before, and this isn't something I'm too familiar with because I am not a math person by any means, but different approaches. I know that there are different, in the tables training that I kind of linked to touches on this too. There are different things that you can do for content across multiple disciplines to make sure it's accessible. So I think the approach is the same, ensuring that, anything is read aloud to screen readers in the correct way. Things are tagged and will be announced properly. I think the basic foundations are the same, color contrast, you don't want to make anything convey meaning without letting folks know, or like students know that message is being conveyed. But I think the approach is the same, but how you do it might be a little different. Okay, let's see. I know we only have a couple minutes left. Let me see if I missed any. Can these rules and tools be applicable to content in a different language? Ooh, that's a good question. I would think so, because I'm trying to think back. When I was a Spanish minor at Brockport, I would write papers in Spanish. And when I would do it on Word, I could still check the accessibility. But with any writing in a different language, you have to set the settings to not be English. You have to set them to that language. But I would think that the rules and the tools would be applicable to that as well, because you're still using the tool in that way. You just have it set to a different language, but it's still going to flag and tell you what might be accessible and what might not be. All right. I think I got all the questions. If I'm missing anything, please feel free to shout out. I know that we are just about at the end of the hour here, and I've done a lot of talking. So if anybody has questions or wants to come off mute, you can feel free. But I think mostly that's it from me. I'll make sure these slides get sent out. But I really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much for coming out and being a part of this, and for listening to me for the past hour. But I hope everyone has a great weekend. And thank you for coming.
Thank you, Megan.
Thanks, Meg. You did awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. That was great.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
I know Lauren was on earlier.
Yeah, and I didn't want to call her out. I was
Yeah.
like, nah, yeah, nah.
Great job. I know we're putting together a play